Hey, everybody. Welcome to the sixth edition of Red May, a month of communist fun, vacation from capitalism. We have, as usual, some terrific shows. Before we start the Red Modernism, I want to let you in. We pretty much have something every day, so check YouTube and you'll see. But this week, we do have global housing struggles. We have a panel on called Days Like This, um, which is our current moment panel. And you can find it all on www.redmayseattle.org. Uh, because we're starting late, I'm going to move you over to the moderator of Red Modernism. Tommy Swenson is the director of the Beacon Cinema, which currently is showing a six-film retrospective hosted with Red May of Miklos Jansco, the great Hungarian director. And so I'll turn it over to Tommy, who will moderate and introduce our guests.
Hello, welcome everyone. Yeah, I'm Tommy. I'm the proprietor at the Beacon Cinema here in Columbia City in Seattle. And I'm very excited to be participating here in Red May. We're joined by three esteemed scholars today, Eszter Polonyi, Zoran Samardzija, and Shaviro. And we're gonna have a great discussion about the cinema of Miklos Jansco. So I'll just share a few sort of quick opening remarks, and then we'll open it up to our panelists to present, and then we'll move into more of a discussion. But I wanted to start with sort of this question. How should history be performed? Perhaps not at all in narrative cinema, where historical figures and their deeds are shoehorned into satisfying dramatic packets that flatter contemporary sensibilities before worming their way into American high school curricula. The potency of images obscures the work of both consuming and fashioning the historical record. Controversies are ironed into a piety that unsurprisingly finds a happy home in conservative thought, which loves nothing more than a lost innocence. History is a series of arguments, but films have little room for caveats and certainly none for works cited pages. Historical films, their grandeur unmatched, tend towards the authoritative incuriousness of American textbooks. Yet, performance and historical navel-gazing are among the most human compulsions. The question of properly staging history is central to the work of filmmaker Miklos Jansco, who enjoyed a significant international renown during the art house bonanza of the 60s and 70s, before entering a prolific obscurity in his native Hungary until his death in 2014. Considered by Béla Tarr to be the greatest of all Hungarian filmmakers, Jansco never wavered in his anti-fascist critique of power dynamics, even after the international film community had largely ceased paying attention. His final work was a short contribution to a Tarr-produced anthology film in 2012, which was conceived as a rebuke to Viktor Orbán's suffocation of artistic expression in Hungarian media. Like most of the master's 80-some credits, his swan song is nearly impossible for American audiences to see. But this month here in Seattle, as part of Red May, the Beacon is offering a six-part reintroduction to Jansco, covering the period 65 to 74, during which his name enjoyed the same breathless esteem as Godard and Antonioni and their fellow European modernists who still haunt rep houses like clockwork. Digitally restored by Hungary's National Film Archive, and distributed in America by Kino Lorber. Each of these six films, The Roundup, The Red and the White, The Confrontation, Winter Wind, Red Psalm, and Electra My Love, showcase Jansco's mastery of epic tracking shots, wading through layers of intricate group choreography. Using the shot and its choreography not as a show-stopping gimmick, but instead to make the viewer feel boiling political tension in their bones and to testify to bloody history. And there's nearly a century of Hungarian history represented and interrogated by this cinematic sampling, from the Roundup's 1860 detention camp to the October Revolution in The Red and the White, and on to post-World War II student debates in The Confrontation. Amid Yangsho's sumptuous pageants, all full of sweeping tracking shots, complex choreography, and insistent critique of power dynamics, history is reclaimed and engaged against the powerful. But the dance between the powerful and the oppressed never steadies. And through Yangsho's body of works, the relative obscurity of Hungarian folk history sits comfortably alongside clear-eyed polemics such as the leaders of the present social system will never relieve the distress of the working classes by their own will. We must organize ourselves so one day the organized workers can set their own power against the present autocratic system. Then it will be possible to make laws protecting the interests of the workers and ensuring the welfare of the people. So Jonathan Rosenbaum called Yangsho a lost continent of cinema on the filmmaker's death in 2014. And was screening these restorations and this discussion. Hopefully it's all part of a collective expedition into this terra incognita. So please welcome our guests here today. And we'll begin with Eszter Polonyi. Eszter is an American-Hungarian art historian working on 20th century art, film, and media in Central East Europe and North America. The history of film and filmmakers from Hungary has been the focus of several of her publications, including articles written for the Hungarian film journal Apertura, an edited volume on Central European left-wing cinema from Film Museum Austria, and one edited collection of writings by the Weimar-era Hungarian film theorist Béla Balázs, who also constituted the subject of her doctoral dissertation. She's currently working on a 2-year ARRS-funded postdoctoral project dedicated to the discourse of faciality in photography at the University of Nova Gorica in Slovenia, where she's been working in the cultural history program as assistant professor since 2020. Before moving to Europe, Eszter taught at the Pratt Institute and at Columbia University, where she received her dissertation in 2017. So Eszter, welcome.
Thanks, Tommy. I've been unmuted. That's great. Thanks so much for the presentation. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to give you a little presentation of Yangsho's work from my perspective as someone who knows a little bit about the history of Hungarian cinema. And to do that, let's see. Oh dear. Thank you so much. I can now see that you guys have my slides, and I'm going to just make sure that I'm able to move forward in the PowerPoint presentation. Yes, I am. Okay, great. All right. So here we go. I'm going to talk for about 10, 15 minutes. If anything goes wrong, please interrupt me. I'm using an Ethernet cable, but you know, I am in Europe and I'm very far from you, and sometimes there's a delay. Okay, so I want to thank you for the invitation to discuss Yangsho's work in the context of Red May. But I also want to thank you for thinking of including Jansco in what promises to be a great month of political cinema programming, because I think Jansco might actually make a lot of sense to Americans right now, at a time that totalitarianism has never felt so near, and that the dysfunction of courts and government institutions have become a daily reality. But also because in today's climate, Jansco might actually make more sense to Americans than he does to many Europeans, particularly Eastern Europeans, but increasingly other types of Europeans. And it kind of breaks my heart to say this. It's not because Jansco has been forgotten here. It's actually quite the contrary. The DVDs that were put out in March by Kino Lorber were made possible because of a massive restoration project that took place at the Hungarian National Film Archive, where his prints were digitally remastered recently. So on both sides of the Atlantic, his films have had recent release. But to very different purpose. Okay, so Jansco's films have always been received as only kind of half intelligible by the West. Too many references, too much Hungarian history. His work appeals despite the extreme fondness he displays toward the nuances of Hungarian culture, literary, musical history. Jansco had appeal regardless of these specificities. And that is beautiful, that there is something about Jansco's work that resonates across different time periods and cultures. But it's also become increasingly important to Jansco's legacy, because while the West looks to Jansco for his capacity to portray victim and oppressor, state and citizen, power and people, and seemingly universal configurations, the East has started to see the opposite in Jansco. More than a timeless voice, an advocate of universal freedoms, Jansco is becoming a, no, please don't, I will change, don't worry about changing the slides, I will change the slides. So Jansco is becoming a local, someone who, according to viewers here, understood perfectly what was going on politically, someone who spoke out against the regime, and someone who would prove to the West how much the Hungarians had suffered under communism. So I'll come back to this thought in a bit, the difference between Jansco's reception in the East, where I am, and in the West, where you guys are. But what I want to do now is give you a little bit of context in which Jansco was working, and perhaps a little bit of specificity of the history he represents, so that you can appreciate what has made him so controversial here. So, okay, now I'm going to go to slide 2. So to understand Jansco's films, it is important to understand the circumstances in which experimental filmmaking could take place in Eastern Europe in the post-war period. Namely, that experimental film, and I realize this is probably not the best term to use to describe Jansco's work, but we'll come back to that later. So experimental film was state-sponsored. This is important to recognize because usually experimental film is understood as non-institutional, non-industrial, but also not affiliated with official bodies of sponsorship that would define, say, sponsored films, for example. This lack of institutionalization was certainly the case with the films of the New Wave that were emerging out of France in the 60s and 70s. These were the product of a system of production, distribution, and exhibition that had been set up outside of the mainstream film industry. In fact, the French New Wave's capacity for critique, for offering an oppositional or counter cinema, can be traced back to the range of alternate spaces, critical practices, and communities by which they were made and for which these films were being made. Certainly their makers aspired to have them appear in mainstream movie theaters. But what made the appearance of a film by Godard in a movie theater otherwise dedicated to Hollywood films so radical was that it constituted an intervention, a subversion of the norm, made possible by the fact that the film comes from the outside of a corporatized global film industry. So the Western experimental film carves out a space in the shadow of the industry and constitutes itself from the outside. Okay, so the same cannot be said about experimental film practices in the Eastern Bloc, because funding for film was determined at the state level. Here there was no outside to the mainstream film industry. All filmmaking was accounted for by officials working within the government administration. Government counsel was involved on all films simply because all films and all eligible filmmakers were supported by the state and allocated a budget for their work. One of the consequences of this difference is that there is not much room for what we call experimental cinema. Let me demonstrate what I mean. So there is a cohort, now we're on slide 3. There is a cohort of Hungarian filmmakers that you may or may not have heard from the 1960s. And this cohort identifies as strictly avant-garde. These are, for instance, Gábor Bódi and Dora Maurer, both conceptualist filmmakers who, or artists, I think they would probably prefer to be known as, whose work was recently exhibited in London and Berlin. And you may have also heard of experimental documentary filmmakers like Pál Schiffer, Judit Elek, and Sándor Sára. But this explicitly experimental cinema only starts seeing light a full 10 years after Jansco started making films, when Hungary actually establishes an experimental film studio called the Béla Balázs Studio, named after the Hungarian-born champion of film art. So the Béla Balázs Studio would occupy something like a periphery to the national film industry. So not really an outside, more like a marginal enough position so that its affiliates could, could benefit from something like a buffer between them and the state, or the state bureaucrats. So Jansco would come to filmmaking before this generation of avant-garde experimenters. In addition, he also comes literally after the country has been depleted of its last talents. Like all filmmakers in Hungary, Jansco learns to make film by enrolling in an academy called the Budapest Academy of Film and Theatrical Art. And he enrolls in 1946, almost immediately, actually literally immediately after the 4 decades of massive emigration from Hungary, so from out of the country. Okay, so with the exception of very few who returned from the war, from after the war, most people in the business of making films had left by then. So you have Alex Korda, for example, and Michael Curtiz, who were at this point very busy making films in the US and the UK. And you have an entire generation, interwar generation of camera operators, scenarists, directors, and actors that had been trained in the Weimar context, many of whom were Jewish, and who had either gotten hired in the US or trained, or Germany, sorry, so hired by Germany. They had fled or they had been executed. So when Jansco enrolls in the academy, there aren't a lot of strong personalities. He later says in an interview that there wasn't actually much teaching either. Academy students taught one another. They were largely self-managed, apparently. Jansco, for some reason, taught his peers, a class on Hungarian literature, on the history of Hungarian literature, and they all teach each other Marx. But there's also actually not much infrastructure at the academy either, or budget. So for instance, something that is quite strange, I think, Jansco doesn't get to make a diploma film because there really isn't a budget for that kind of thing. There's literally no money to make anything that isn't otherwise of immediate service to the state. And so Jansco is basically trained as a vocational craftsperson. And graduating in 1951 doesn't really mean much of a landmark for him, because he goes directly from making documentaries as a student to working for an institution called the Newsreel and Documentary Film Plant. I think I have an image. There we go. Yeah. So basically, he starts off as part of the vast apparatus of state propaganda, and he is a cog in the wheel. And what I want to do is I want to show you a very brief segment of an early film by Jansco. I think we could probably all imagine what a documentary film commissioned by the post-war Hungarian government might look like. But before we get any further into Jansco's work, I want to show you the kind of subject matter and film vocabulary out of which he would forge his own quite singular version of film form. And this is not Jansco's first film, but it may as well have been, because I'm told that of the 12 plus films that he made for the newsreel and documentary film plant are all quite similar in that nothing about them actually suggests that they were directed by the man who would later become Jansco the auteur. Okay. So this is going to be a segment from a film he created with this team in 1953. The purpose of the film is to commemorate the success of the annual harvest at a place called Orosháza, which is a tiny village community in Hungary. After this has transitioned to a nationalized, collectivized, and modernized model of agriculture, as you will note from the focus on the output, so the agrarian output and the community's new combine harvester. In addition, it might be significant to note the setting of the film, which is in the middle of the Hungarian Great Plains, and the relatively high density of people and operating equipment in relation to this highly rural and sparsely inhabited location. Okay, this clip is about 3 minutes long. And if actually it doesn't automatically, okay. Sorry, I'm just going to pause and say that this is a passage in the film which takes place after they have been working in the morning. So this is their like noontime break, and it's going to move into the sort of the narrative intrigue of the documentary, which is a storm.
Ebédkor nem talisznyáznak többé a dózsások. A szövetkezet konyhájáról ízletes meleg étel jut minden dolgozónak. Ez alatt a dózsa legifjabb nemzedéke az idény napköziben jó étvággyal uzsonnázik. Veszélyben a learatott gabona. Minden perc késedelem pótolhatatlan veszteséggel fenyeget. Táblák egy részét. Nehéz próba elé került Bastyán elvtárs, hiszen némelyek szerint földhúzát géppel aratni lehetetlen. Ő mégis megkísérli ezt a lehetetlen.
Okay. So it's kind of crazy that could have been Jansco's first film. But on the other hand, it also isn't that crazy. So what is this about? We have a natural catastrophe that is threatening the crops. And the amount of wheat that this little community will harvest, despite the storm, is going to be incredibly successful, entirely thanks to this tractor and its intrepid driver. And the message of the film that Jansco is making here is clear. Communities like Oroshaza that opt in on the collectivized model of agriculture stand to benefit in terms of food, in terms of work, in terms of yield, but also, as we saw from the noontime break, also they stand to benefit in terms of their health and their happiness. But of course, by this point in Hungary, no farmer had not been integrated into the nationalized mode of agricultural production, whether voluntarily or not. And the film reflects both the lack of subtlety of the media during the so-called Rákosi era of Hungarian communism, which spanned the decade following the Second World War, and the effort of its state officials to cover up mounting and the mounting and very real costs of the country's collectivization, namely systemic repression and mass incarceration. The film's soundtrack implies some of this gap between lived experience and advertised reality. Sounds in the film are clearly studio created, which in 1953 would have been a technical necessity given the cumbersome nature of Soviet sound recording devices at this moment. But the announcement of official sounding numbers and the pat slogan-like congratulations and in a very heavy-handed and nearly unbroken voiceover is also an indication of the Potemkin-like function of film at this moment. Later in the interview, Jansco describes, Jansco describes the process of making these films as elaborate staging. He describes the length of time, 1 month, he had needed to find the right kind of locals to cast as peasants, to have them swap their clothes. So he actually has them wearing their Sunday best, and they're tilling the soil in white pressed shirts. He describes scripting their dialogues, the choreographing of their movements as they move off and on screen, the choir that had to be organized so that their singing could be post-synchronized with the image. Set during the October harvest, the film was actually shot in June. They at the time, they had no idea what the year's harvest would look like. It's called a newsreel, but it's closer to theater. And it was all propaganda, Jansco would say later. He would say it was all lies. So I want to pause here and think about this term, lies, and more generally the frustration Jansco felt with respect to Hungary's communist government. Firstly, the frustration was real. The film is made 8 years into the new Soviet Hungary, which had been established in 1945. So this is 8 years into the regime of Hungary's staunch Stalinist loyalist, a guy called Mátyás Rákosi. And here I'm going to give you just a really bare bones timeline. But by the summer of 1953, the film that this film had been made in no longer includes Stalin. 1953 foretold of the possibility of an end to hardline Stalinism for Hungary. In 3 years' time, in 1956, when police opened fire on a group of students protesting the imposition of domestic policies by Soviet authorities in July, the subsequent backlash would escalate into a confrontation between Hungary and the Soviet Union. Revolutionary militia, organized by the underground, fought for the secret police to be disbanded, for a new government to be formed. So this is all in 1956. for a more moderate leader to be appointed. Imre Nagy was the prime minister, and for the country to establish free elections. So 1956 would also be a turning point in Janco's career. He stops making only documentaries at around this time. Although he was not in Hungary at the time of the 1956 uprising, he claimed that had he been, he would have gotten arrested. He quits the Communist Party in 1956. And it is also at this point that Janco shifts into fictionalized filmmaking, so feature-length fiction film. Sometime between 1958 and 1966, he begins producing films with a kind of modernist sensibility that would earn him his reputation as an auteur. Now, on the basis of this series of feature-length films that he makes in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, Janco's take on communism is basically merciless. So take The Red and the White, his fifth feature. Let me just move forward. Oh, sorry, here's sort of the beginning of his filmography, to give you a sense of the division between the newsreel documentaries, which he starts off making, and sort of his transition into feature-length films, which happens after the time of the 1956 uprising. Okay, so The Red and the White. His fifth feature, Janco features Hungarians fighting for the cause of the Soviet Union at the very time and in the very space of its inception. That is, in Russia at the end of the First World War. The topic of 1919 had been and would remain absolutely central to narratives of Hungarian communism. And it's not because of the Hungarians who went to Russia to fight for communism. It's more because of sympathizers of Bolshevism back home in Hungary who succeeded in overthrowing the Hungarian government in 1919, when for a full 188 days, Hungary would become a Soviet republic, one of the first. Anyway, 188 days of fame. To broach the topic of 1919 prior to Janco had meant conjuring up communism as homegrown. 1919 was a subject of plays, poems, novels about novels, several film scripts, many of which never actually made it off paper. It was a subject of Hungarian communist myth and lore. So when Janco takes on the topic of 1919, he actually does it to deflate Soviet-style communism of its unequivocal sense of value, truth, and meaning. Instead of a story of communism casting its spell over a nation's youth, artists, writers, and intellectuals who rise up in unity against imperialist warmongering, communism as a set of ideals is nowhere to be found in Janco's film. Basically, this is the story, and here I was going to show you images of 1919 in Hungary. In terms of the posters, I was briefly going to show you a map, but given that Hungarians do that all the time, I decided not to show you a map, but to show you posters. So it's the story of Hungarians going out to look for communism, finding it nowhere, and then getting massacred in the meantime. If anything, it's anti-heroic. And to the extent that it questions the ideological legitimacy of red over white, you could actually argue that it's also anti-revolutionary. Okay, so Janco's previous film, which is called the Roundup or Szegény Legények. By the way, there is a discrepancy between the Hungarian and the English versions of the titles. That's kind of interesting. So the Roundup is from 1966, and so it immediately precedes the previous one, and it's no less harsh in the denunciation of Hungarian communism. This film takes as its topic the aftermath of Hungary's 1848 peasant uprising, and the emphasis here should be placed on aftermath. Europe underwent a series of republican revolts against European monarchies between 1848 and 1849. There were uprisings in Sicily, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. They all end really, really badly and result in widespread disillusionment. except in Hungary. In Hungary, interestingly, there turns out to be a point to all of the bloodshed. Austria becomes Austria-Hungary. Hungary's imperial occupiers decide to make Hungarians almost equal partners. This happens a bit later in 1867, but at least it ends better than it does for the rest of Europe, such as France, for example, which gets another Napoleon. So in Jansco's hands, 1848 is stripped of its status as a milestone of Hungarian republicanism. Primarily, Jansco seems to be arguing because of the completely unheroic nature of its protagonists, the Hungarian people involved in the uprising. The intrigue of this film, The Roundup, revolves around the Austrians' ability to locate and identify those who rose up against them in 1848 within the Hungarian countryside, ostensibly with the purpose of then executing them. They round up a random sampling of Hungarian peasants, put them in prison, and then wait for them to betray each other's identities in exchange for being able to leave. As the film unfolds, one peasant after another attempts to trade information about another peasant's identity in order to be saved, and they are executed one by one. But the point is that they continue trying, despite the fact, which we learn really early in the film, that there is not a single one of the 1848 revolutionaries among this crowd, and they know it. So zero heroism is put on display. Instead, the film is about the empty machinations of power that are being applied arbitrarily and for no reason, blindly, seemingly for its own sake. I could go on describing other films about the legacy of communist history by Jansco, but I think you get my point. Communism in the Hungarian state variety fails in most of his films. I think it is also clear that Jansco 100% intended his films to question Hungarian state communism. One reason to suspect that he targeted Hungarian communism was the degree to which Jansco anticipated his film's censorship. With one or two possible exceptions, all the feature films Jansco would direct in Hungary between the mid-60s and the mid-80s employ the distantiation technique of historical allegory. Jansco basically creates one period film after another, seemingly in order to evade the accusation of explicit government critique, which he more or less does. I think the idea that critique forms part of Jansco's approach to communism has been clear to critics, biographers, and theorists alike, but it has, interestingly, is not prevented him from being received as left-wing, even a radical left-wing filmmaker. His reputation in France, and to the extent that I could determine in Italy and the UK, is as a Marxist filmmaker. Several seminal texts or bodies of texts include Jansco's work, such as the 1970 issues of Cahiers du Cinéma, where Comolli and Narboni are ultimately critical of his work, which they write undermines the why of communism by focusing too much on the how of Stalinism. But the fact that Comolli and Narboni and probably other members of the Cahiers crowd are watching Jansco's work, I think is an important testimony to its legacy with political cinema, as is his inclusion in Peter Wollen's seminal differentiation between the two different types of political avant-garde in 1976. His reception in the English language literature since the 1970s has also firmly characterized him as no less than a political modernist, without any dispute regarding his left-wing views or the red origins of his particular form of modernism. But speaking as a recent emigre to Eastern Europe and in close proximity, but hopefully not earshot, of Viktor Orban, I think perhaps the time has come to put Jansco's left-wing political aesthetics and the paradox that they entail into the spotlight as far as his reception is concerned, because his politics are contradictory. It is contradictory that we receive Jansco both as a diehard critic of state communism and as a communist through and through. Was he less than communist? Was he Leninist, Trotskyist, anarchist, crypto-Stalinist? What was his relationship to ethno-nationalism? the Woodrow Wilsonian type of self-determination, Transylvanian politics, and most pressingly, is there a form of utopian imagination, utopian consciousness, in which all of these things could be believed in at the very same time? Can Jansco help us understand what became of the Hungarian left wing? What I want to ask is that in watching Jansco's film, if you have any intention of watching them, you could ask yourself this question: what exactly is it that makes Jansco a red modernist? That is a political modernist in the 21st century US context. I'm not going to answer this question, given that I've already gone over time, but I want to leave you with the thought that Jansco remained left-wing, not just despite his experience of Hungarian communism, but also partially because of his experience of Hungarian state communism. And I realize that this is a slightly different reading of Jansco's than what has been so far produced, which is that Jansco rejected state communism and the bureaucratization of belief, but remained a Marxist at heart. I wonder if it is possible to understand him as seeing the systemic, civic, and infrastructural aspects of state communism not as Kafka's emptiness and Nietzschean nihilism, but a way out of the deleterious effects of over-identification and the cult of personality. Maybe our conception of the avant-garde and of auteurism has been too narrow, too Western. Why does experimentation with film have to happen in an enclave? Wouldn't training in a decentralized mode of production also be adequate preparation for the collective practice of filmmaking? Couldn't we understand collectivized film production as integral to distributed forms of authorship like auteurism? So in conclusion, I return to the images I start with. Jansco's documentary newsreels. Yes, I think we can all agree that this is run-of-the-mill propaganda. There's not a single original shot, framing, or composition, but that is what it took to become Jansco. I look at these perfectly bland images, and what I see is access to an apparatus of imaginary construction and mass consciousness that has the ability to both bring to the surface and to banish into the distant horizon line, to elevate and dissipate, to repress, but also to empower and redress. I see the repeating actions like harvesting wheat with a scythe, singing, even adjusting the rotation of a combine harvester as permutations on a theme or variations on a folk tune. The red phoenix of Electra My Love as the reverse of the newsreel agency's helicopter. The anonymity of these faces, not as a sacrifice of individuality, but as a celebration of the universal right to insurgency. So I guess the question I want to leave you with is whether Jansco might help us rethink what it takes to make experimental cinema, and whether this can in turn change where we look for experimental cinema, and what it is that continues to make Jansco accessible outside of his Eastern European audiences and continues to convince the West of his radical political modernism. Okay, I'll stop sharing.
All right. Thank you so much, Eszter. That's really fascinating, really interesting, teasing out those contradictions in his political aims and in the form of exploration. I think there's a lot more we can get into there, but let's hear from our other folks here. Next up, we'll talk with Zoran Samardzija. Zoran is Associate Professor of Cinema and Television Arts at Columbia College Chicago. His research explores post-communist East European and Balkan cinemas in order to address the socio-political ramifications of European unification. His book, Post-Communist Malaise, Cinematic Responses to European Integration, was published in 2020 by Rutgers. So thank you and welcome, Zoran.
Oh, thank you for having me, and thank you, Eszter. I'm going to sort of piggyback on some of what she said, which I thought was pretty interesting. And maybe during discussion, we'll get more into this. I believe he was away in China, during the 56 events. But I guess I want to go with this notion of contradictions and just talk about this notion of red modernism and think about how maybe stylistically this really applies to Jansco. I think given all that interesting detail Eszter gave us, I think there's this question of, well, what does modernism mean in the Soviet sphere? Eszter pointed out something really interesting that, particularly in Hungary, you could get experimental films made on the state level. How widely they were seen and anything like that is another issue. But if we think about what kind of modernism means, perhaps more from a Western Marxist perspective, this brings back that he sort of debates people like Brecht, Lukács, or Bloch, whether, do we need to engage in sort of realist aesthetics versus modernist experimentation? And, the description of the panel, right, has a kind of great quote from Hoberman: radical form in the service of radical content. And what I want to do, perhaps before I get into maybe some of the specifics of the film, is complicate or question the notion of cinematic modernism in the context of, the Soviet sphere. There's, I think, a basic question of, well, do we define communism itself as a kind of form of modernism, right? In the sense of how it's future directed. You can think about all the great posters of people looking off the future, and even some of the newsreel there Eszter shows. It ends where they make like a giant loaf of bread, and they're cutting for sort of the happy kid. So there is a sense in which communism is already a certain degree of modernism. There's an interesting contradiction, right? I mean, we know, we've heard about communist regimes, on the one hand, like Eszter said, supporting some experimentation, but also rejecting or criticizing it. Though I don't believe Jansco was explicitly censored. I mean, there were criticisms of his work to nationalists, to formalists, so forth, this kind of stuff that you would commonly hear. But what strikes me, and I think this is very important here, is, and this is sort of the question kind of Eszter was raising, is how do we move from the kind of socialist realism into the kind of more modernist abstraction that we see, particularly developing across the 6 films in this series. And one thing I just want to do is throw out perhaps a definition of socialist realism that I always liked. And this is sort of from Lev Mankiewicz. So the point of socialist realism is to, quote, show the future in the present by projecting the perfect world of future socialist society onto a visual reality familiar to the viewer. And that's certainly something we see kind of in that newsreel, the sort of the peasants overcoming nature, right? Working collectively to create their harvest. And, there's some great points there about the theatricality and staging of it I want to get into. But there's something else here I think that's important is, if you were to look at Jansco's first feature, which isn't particularly interesting, I believe it's called Bells Have Gone to Rome. It's sort of fairly socialist realist war drama about teens fighting the last days of World War II. You look at it and just on a sort of formal and shot level, there are many kind of flourishes of, long takes, fluid crane shots, even some sort of deep focus. So, the language of socialist realism, just as a visuals, aren't that, and they're not that different from necessarily what we get in Jansco's more abstract works. It's just that he reorganizes them or inverts them in a way that I think is particularly interesting. And there's a real gap or in change in style between this sort of first fairly standard socialist realist drama, The Bells Have Gone to Rome, and his next 2 features, which aren't part of this, and those are My Way Home and Cantana. I think what happens is, and this is the kind of interesting thing about this, is the influence of Antonioni, right? There are many interviews where Jansco refers to Antonioni as, his master and all of that. I believe La Notte in particular, the second of that early 60s trilogy, was pretty influential. So on the one hand, and what I'm trying to trace here before you get into some of the films, is you have this sort of legacies of socialist realism that was sort of talked about. But I think what happens in Jansco, at least with Roundup and the Red and the White is they get fused with this sort of Antonioni-like modernism. And to me, I think what that allows for is for Jansco to really rework the relationship between the group and individual and the landscape, right? You know, the kind of narrative in Antonioni and perhaps, I don't know, Red Desert being most obvious of this is, right, you know, the individual or the group alienated, and this is expressed through the visual relationship with architecture and landscape. Because, I mean, I think you're already, you know, in the sort of Soviet cinema of the 30s and some of the socialist realism have a sense of the group in relationship to the landscape. But, you know, you see that in the sort of the Harvest film. And so I wanted to stress, I think, the importance of Antonioni to his development. And of course, you know, later he'll go to Italy. I don't know if Stephen's going to talk maybe about some of those or not. You know, he makes The Pacifist in 1970 with Monica Vitti, sorry. And you know, it's interesting when he goes to Italy. I mean, I don't want to call that like a sort of Antonioni knockoff, because I don't think it quite is. But you could clearly see how that influence is working. So, you know, the Red Modernism of Jansco to me is intriguing, because if we were to think of the sort of more Soviet tradition of modernism, right, Eisenstein, Soviet montage, and all of that, you know, you can trace that still. I mean, people like Dusan Makavejev in Yugoslavia kind of takes on montage. But what to make of the long takes and the staging in Jansco's films, to me, is very intriguing and very unique. And, you know, we can kind of perhaps later talk about his influence. And what struck me about watching these 6 films is, I think, how quickly he develops. I think by The Red and the White, and particularly the 3 after, I think some of the Antonioni influence dissipates, or the kind of realist core of his visuals moves away. By the time of The Confrontation, certainly Red Psalm, Lecture My Love, you know, we have rituals, gestures, and in some ways the musical taking over. And I always thought it'd be an interesting double feature of Red Psalm and I don't know, any number of sort of Stalinist musicals made in the late 50s to show you how, you know, what the inverted relationship here is between the kind of socialist realism of the, you know, happy peasants, you know, where the future's already arrived, the future being communism, versus what you get in something like Red Psalm. And so I think what's interesting or contradictory about Jansco is, in some ways, his political modernism is both kind of Western and Eastern on some level. Maybe that explains why in this sort of 10-year period he had international success. You know, Eszter mentioned the sort of response with French critics. You know, I believe Sight and Sound wrote up about him in like 1969, 1970. I don't know if it really was, you know, the 76 film Public Vice, Public Virtues that kind of dissipated his international career. But, you know, he continued to make really interestingly radical movies in the 80s. You know, Stephen and I talked over Facebook about one, Season of the Monsters, which is in some ways more baffling, I think, than any of these other ones. And of course, late in his career, he was fairly popular in Hungary with his sort of absurdist comedies, beginning with would be Lord's Lantern in Budapest. But just thinking specifically about this period, you know, what strikes me, and this is again the sort of contradictions, I would perhaps want to characterize Jansco in this period as a Marxist anti-communist, if that's fair. But I don't think that necessarily means what it does for Western audiences. I mean, I certainly, when you watch kind of the end of Red Psalm or Lecture My Love, there's a tendency to think of sort of a Trotsky-like permanent revolution, and certainly you get that at the end of a Lecture My Love, right? But what struck me about the films is how there's a sort of refusal to sort of articulate any positive politics or kind of convey historical struggles in any realist terms. And I'll sort of explain what I mean by that. And, Esther's correct, right? He sort of deferred the critiques of the present into kind of historical pieces. But I'm not sure, for example, you knowing anything about Croatian fascism really helps you with Winter Wind, for example, right? So I think it's a little bit beyond allegory, right? The class struggles, I think, in Red Psalm and Electra seem, to me, not really materialist per se, rather than they are some sort of formalization of, I think, the techniques of oppression. So in some ways, kind of like his gestures, his dances, his mechanics are kind of enacting some sort of laws of history, as they opposed to really getting into any kind of materialist conditions. So I think in some ways I see him kind of engaged in a kind of negative dialectic. There's no real kind of endpoint or synthesis to his critiques, right? And I'll get a little bit more into that. But and I think this is a little bit clear with Winter Wind and the confrontation. Winter Wind, that was the one I was probably the least familiar with when we were watching, partly because for whatever reason that one was impossible to find in a good copy. I always had like a bad copy of it. But what I was struck by with Winter Wind is it's really more about the kind of mechanics of right-wing paranoia, martyrdom, and sort of the co-opting of revolutionary idealism than it has anything really to do with the specifics of fascism. The opening of that film, which kind of gives you some context, is in some ways a deflection, because the film, I don't think, gives you any real understanding of fascism. But what it does, it doesn't give you any real understanding of fascism as a kind of geopolitical totality, right? What it does is, I think, it embeds the mechanics of fascism in social relations, right? So the film isn't, I don't think, trying to abstract or mystify fascism as it does try to overtly concretize it. And I think that's an important thing with Jansco. I mean, there's a tendency to describe his work as kind of abstract, which I think is fair, but I perhaps want to maybe be contrarian there and going along with this notion of contradictions. It's so overtly concrete to be abstract. In other words, right, it's the gesture, the mechanics, the camera movements, the staging. Whether they add up into a kind of totality is a kind of interesting question. But I think Winter Wind, I do think, gives you a notion of one theme that runs through most of these films. And I think that's just the theme of revolutionary idealism and how it shifts into totalitarianism and terror. And this is where I would say the kind of contradiction of a kind of Marxist anti-communist or perhaps anti-Stalinist is more accurate. I think the confrontation is intriguing about this. It's sort of set in the aftermath of the Second World War, and you have this group of revolutionary communist students who visit a monastery to recruit the priests and students to their cause. The plot's pretty minimal, but what's interesting is how everything sort of subdivides. The communist students are in different factions. They debate whether they should engage in terror, engage in dialogue. There are even, these kind of horrific Holocaust allusions, right? We're going to shave your head and all of this. All the while, you have sort of state power, the police exiting. I don't want to give it too much away to the film, but the character, I think, of Jutka is intriguing. The sort of how the way the film opens and the way the film ends gives you a sense of this sort of circularity or notion of kind of revolutionary idealism betrayed or quickly turning into terror. And I see that kind of running through a lot of these films. In some ways, even Red and the White. And just as an aside, and maybe there's something conversation, I believe the Soviets re-edited Red and the White. It was a co-production, and I don't think they looked too kindly on it. And they tried re-editing it into something more heroic. I've not seen that version, and I don't know how you necessarily re-edit that in anything kind of more heroic. And I'll wrap up here with a couple other points, but and then the one main one I want to really convey are just a sort of notion of modernism or cinematic modernism being far more contradictory in the Soviet sphere because I think of the weight of communism, particularly socialist realism, right? You could say with someone like Godard and counter cinema, oh, well, rejecting Hollywood, right? I don't think that's quite going on. As Eszter said, you didn't make a movie necessarily unless you were somehow integrated already into it anyways. But there's an interesting quote here, I think, that Jansco himself, this is from an interview, and this is kind of describing films from this period. Those films are never, quote, these films are never accurate analysis of given periods, nor are they historical reflections. They're not concrete analyses of anything, rather sequences or visions, or let's say fake sermons, fake ballots. Their pointed departure is the denial of oppression presented in a somewhat utopian manner. And the question, I think...
could you just read that one more time?
Oh, sorry, yeah, read a little quicker here. Quote, those films are never accurate analyses of given periods, nor are they historical reflections. They're not concrete analyses of anything, rather sequences of visions, or let's say fake sermons, fake ballets. Their point of departure is the denial of oppression presented in a somewhat utopian manner. And so if there is a Marxism to his work, I mean, to me, it seems maybe a little bit more aligned with someone with like Adorno, not with the kind of snobby high modernism of, we can only listen to Schoenberg or whatever, but in the sense of the political project is more of a negative dialectic, because there's so many contradictions in his work, the horror versus the beauty. But I want to just wrap up this question, and this is maybe just conversation, is where do we see his influence today? And I was struggling to answer that question. I won't go on my kind of rant about why I don't like the term slow cinema. But quickly, I just don't think grouping directors who have long takes together makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, because they certainly have many different projects. I think the closest I see an influence is maybe with Laszlo Nemes and Son of Saul, and I think the even more interesting Sunset. But which leads me to my question about this period, maybe to be provocative here, was this sort of all a stylistic dead end, or is it something we need to kind of keep rediscovering and keep understanding what he's trying to tell us about the mechanics of oppression? That's all for me. Thank you.
That's really wonderful. Thank you. There are just so many contradictions here, and I think we are all fascinated because we do see the how fruitful they can be to tease them out, even if we can't resolve them. Also, I like the idea of maybe using the red and the white as a film school sample for budding editors and say, turn this into a pro-Soviet movie. But anyways, let's hear from Stephen now. Thank you again, Zoran. Stephen Shaviro is the DeRoy Professor of English at Wayne State University in Detroit, and his new book, Extreme Fabulations, Science Fictions of Life, will be available this August from Goldsmiths Press. But thank you for being here, Stephen, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks. Well, I haven't studied Eastern European cinema as directly or as at length as either Eszter or Zoran has, but I found both of their comments really generative, and I'll try to sort of follow on from them. Basically, what I tried to do in preparation for this is not only watch the 6 reissued films, but watch as many other Jansco films as I could get my hands on. Though there are a number I still haven't watched, and a number or more I still haven't found copies of. But anyway, with English subtitles. But anyway, my general sense of Eastern European film in the communist period, is that they're all kind of negotiating between state censorship and making, anti-tyranny and anti-state arguments. But what's really interesting about a lot of these films across different countries, when I taught a class on this, I did Poland, Hungary, the former Czechoslovakia, and the former Yugoslavia mostly, is that even when they're criticizing the society, it's not only just that they're criticizing it, surreptitiously to get through censorship, but also that what they envision as the better alternative is not what they ended up with, or is not what we have in America today, or what they ended up with after the end of communism. And so one of the interesting things is to think, I mean, some Eastern European films are much closer to social realism, or even to like, well, not to social realism, but kind of miserableism. They sort of are naturalistic in order to show suffering, and others are more extravagant. But Jansco just seems to me to be completely unlike anybody else in terms of how he works through all these issues. So here I'm building off both what Eszter said and what Zoran was saying. I mean, the thing about, start with Zoran talking about slow cinema and long takes. I agree with him. They really are many different things, and you can't just put it together. What Jansco seems to be doing in his long takes is very, very different from either from Antonioni, who's clearly the big influence, or from somebody like Béla Tarr, who comes after him, but also from other European directors who have long take styles. And part of the reason for that is that most of these other styles tend to be minimal. I mean, if you think of like one of my all-time favorite movies, Chantal Akerman's Jan Dielman, you have a 3-hour film with like 3 days in the life of the main character, and we see most of the time fixed camera shots showing her doing housework. And it's really intense because it becomes hypnotic. The monotony becomes hypnotic. And then because when you see her make a very tiny error in something she's done perfectly 25 times already, it's like a major shock. So that is one kind of strategy which slow cinema can do. But it seems that what Jansco is doing is very different. He's more maximalist than minimalist. His cameras they're constantly moving, but especially in things like Red Sob and Electra, but in many other films from that period as well, the screen is really packed with different things. You constantly move from one group of people to another group of people, or you follow one group of people, but there are different foregrounds and backgrounds compared to them. And we're always moving around in these circles or in these semicircles, as well as back and forth horizontally. And it's kind of like there's a certain mode of engagement, or even say it creates a certain mode of sense of space and time, which is very different from what other filmmakers using long takes do. Another way to put this is, I'm emphasizing the formal stuff first because he seems to be an incredible formal innovator and experimenter. And this is something that continues past the films we're seeing into some of his later work, which I've always seen some of. But he's always, what film can be seen as a kind of articulation of space and time. This is done in a very different way with montage, like in the Soviet montage of the 20s, than it is in straightforward Hollywood classical editing styles, and again, differently in commercial Hollywood films and recent editing styles, and differently again in a lot of Eastern European films. So I don't have a complete scheme of all the different possibilities, but it seems that what Jansco is doing is sort of the general sense. I mean, often long takes, especially with the camera not moving, are indicating that like this is a block of space and time which has to be seen in its whole integrity. You don't have close-up which isolate certain details, but you have to see how everything relates to the whole. But when he moves the camera as much as he does, and when he goes beyond realism to have all these kind of dances and things like that, and approaches his Zoran instead approaches the musical, then he's really giving a sense of time and space in a very different way. I'm not sure I have a good positive characterization of what that is, but it has something to do with the fact that we don't have a block of space and time in a realist sense, because space and time are always in fluctuation and motion. As I said, as I was watching these Jansco films, I was writing about a lot of them on Facebook as I saw them. And one thing I was actually reminded of some interesting, very recent work in film theory, which doesn't deal with his films at all, but which raises issues, which I think he cuts across. So one of the books I was reading was Eugenie Brinkema's book, Life-Destroying Diagrams. And this is a film about rigidity and horror. She talks about The Human Centipede and other very disreputable horror films, as well as about some recent European, very downbeat European art films like Michael Haneke and stuff like that. And she suggests in all these works that you have this kind of rigidity of form, and which works in such a way that just by trying to be rigorously a formalist, the director ends up with presenting us with a horrific view of destruction, containment, inability to move, and things like that. So, I mean, the sort of center of her book is when she looks at the human centipede films and suggests that these films are embodying the structure of ethics according to the French Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, in which you're always in a position of guilt, always in a position of being in the wrong, always in a position of having obligations but never being able to meet them, things like that. Okay, so the opposite pole of this is another recent book, film theory I read, Domieta Tolasco's The Rhythm of Images. And here she tries to talk about fluidity and change, and how images, again, in some of her privileged examples, which include both art films and avant-garde films, we get a sense that rhythm, a kind of life of materiality, of which subjectivity is just an extension, is not capturable in kind of regular, rigid forms, because rhythm could be understood as what departs from meter. If meter is the metronome or the military march, then rhythm, and you can talk about both classical music and jazz in the 20th century examples of this, departs from the rigidity of the rhythm, opens things up in different ways. And so she has a different group of films and is seeing them as kind of liberating, releasing us from structures which has a political import. Now, what struck me about these Jansco films is that they seem to be doing both of these things at the same time. They're both subordinating like the spectacle or pageant of history to these very rigidly diagrammatic structures, and yet at the same time suggesting this kind of incredible fluidity in terms of how they move, how we move through space and time, how space and time don't seem quite homogeneous the way they normally would in long take films, because all the variation working through them, and because the camera itself, I mean, is that you sort of don't have a normal subject-object structure where the camera is a point of view looking at an object world, but rather that the camera enters into the world because it moves through it, and its motions, as well as the motions of the people and the dancing and singing, are all sort of happening together on a similar plane. So I thought this is a very dramatic way to think about the total opposites, which seem to be at work in many of these films. We have this kind of hyper-formalist rigidity, and we have this kind of liberating fluidity both at the same time. And those are juxtaposed with not only with one another, but they also have to be sort of placed on top of the visions of structures of power and rebellion, which form the kind of political content of the films. And I'd have to spend more time and probably a lot of effort to try to figure out how this works as a kind of, I'd like to be able to formulate it more precisely, and I'm just groping towards that now. I don't have a sense of it, but it seems to me that this would both highlight how, as a formal inventor, how rich and creative Jansco was, and how different he was from other uses, which may even seem superficially similar, and also to suggest how this would be a way of understanding his political position, both in terms of getting state socialist approved films, which nonetheless suggest criticism, and in terms of, in the post-communist era, how he continues his films seem to be more cynical, nihilistic, or hopeless, but nonetheless are, again, trying different permutations of the same kind of formal devices in order to express different dimensions of space and time, and of people who are located in these spaces and times who are interrelated in all these kind of flowing and complex ways. So, I mean, you can see that in the content. I mean, I'll just mention this, since Zoran was mentioning Winter Wind. It's about Croatian nationalists in the 1930s who are from a base in Hungary are attacking the Yugoslav state. It's also about, they're also preparing for, there's a lot of reference to Marseille in France. And 6 months after when the film takes place is when the king of Yugoslavia, or of Serbia, was assassinated by Croatian nationalists. But there's also another part of it, which, again, some of these things I know historically and pick up on. And I'm not sure that you need to know the details to understand the film, but the details historical details always seem to explain it better. So basically, the guy in the main character in Winter Wind is a Croatian nationalist, and he believes in national liberation. But he repeatedly throughout the film, he's confronted and refuses to pledge his support to the leader of the Croatian nationalist movement, Ante Pavelic, who was a fascist, who was in exile in Mussolini's Italy at the time the film takes place, and who later, after the Nazi invasion, came in and set up a Croatian fascist puppet state. So we have a main character who is part of this, what was mostly a kind of fascistic nationalist group, but who himself is idealistic and rejects the fascism. And again, that's a background detail which, if you know it, adds another layer of sense to that film. But I think, again, you have to see it against the general way we have all this political infighting, all this. I mean, Winter Wind is one of the best films in terms of the six, in terms of how it's restless. The camera is never still, and the people are never still. Nobody ever sits down. They're always wandering around back and forth, going inside, going outside, going from one room to another, going around the lands, around the house, and it's kind of this constant motion and flux. I don't think it signifies liberation per se, but it's sort of, he's creating a world through all this motion, both of the characters and of the camera, on top of which the particular political and historical situation, which you may or may not know more or less about, is overlaid. So I guess I'll stop there. We should have some time for discussion, and we've all gone over time. But it seems to me that, I mean, Tommy started by quoting Jonathan Rosenbaum saying that Jansco is, at least for the West, an undiscovered continent. And if you extend beyond these six films to later periods in his filmmaking, which are also very impressive from the ones I've seen so far, he's really one of the most, he's a peer of, some of the great modernist filmmakers, European filmmakers like Godard and Antonioni, but he's really doing something quite unique, which nobody else did. And that also, Zoran mentioned some recent Hungarian films, which might show his influence, but it's also why I don't think it's because it's a dead end. I think it's because there's something so singular about it and so powerfully accomplished that it's very hard to make it, for anybody to make an imitation Jansco film. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Before we move on to more discussion, Philip just wanted to chime in with a little pitch about more upcoming Red May stuff. So Philip, what do you have?
Hey, I just want to say that this is our third year doing Red May online. And next year, fingers crossed, we will be doing it live again, as well as some online events. So it's going to cost a considerable amount more. If you like what we do at Red May, go to www.redmayseattle.org. You can donate at the page that says Fan the Flames of Red May, which you can also find on online. It's our GoFundMe page. We also have a Patreon. So do think about that. We do have a great program this year, too. The Red and the White tonight at 7:30 at the Beacon if you live in Seattle. If you don't, tomorrow you can hear Rick Wolf talk about global capitalism and the persistence of Cold War ideology at 11 a.m. and at 3 in the afternoon. I'm sorry, this is on Friday I'm talking about. 3 in the afternoon on Friday, you can see Jody Dean, Doug Henwood, Charles Mudady, Aziz Rana, and Colleen Lai talk about days like this from the old Shirelles song. That's our version of the current moment, where you can talk about anything that's going on. On Saturday at 11 a.m., we have Marxist Poetics with David Lau, Sarah Ehlers, and Aditya Bao. And on Sunday at 3 p.m., Sunday the 8th, Policing the City with Jared Shanahan, Donna Murch, Annie Gray Fisher, and Dan Berger as the moderator. So check out those. Look at the whole schedule. We've got 3 more weeks of this. And Tommy, take it over and let's have a question period.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what came through most clearly through all of these talks are just, you know, these fascinatingly irresolvable contradictions inside Jansco's work. Just to like to reiterate some of what we hit on, there's this, you know, Marxist critique that he's offering up that's very much at odds with any support of state communism, you know, very much against state communism, but without being Trotskyist or anarchist and really having these very hyper political films that don't seem to have a concrete positive political project behind them. And they're dealing with historical allegory that refuses to convey historical struggles in realistic terms. He has sort of an abstract approach to narrative that's at odds with very concrete formal techniques that are being deployed in very intentional ways. And the sort of contrast between the social realism that he's growing out of into the red modernism, as we're choosing to define it, that sort of is at the heart of his style. The motion and movement and flux of the people and the groups against the landscape, contrasting with sort of the political stuckness that everyone of the situations that they find themselves in, and the oppressive power that's at them. And I liked how Eszter put it, sort of bringing things to the surface as they are also banished into the horizon, and subordinating the spectacle of history to these diagrammatic structures, suggesting a fluidity of space and time. So all these complicated contradictions, dialectics, negative dialectics are their syntheses. And I want to return and repose a question that Eszter said, which is there a form of utopian consciousness where all these contradictions can be true at the same time? And what is there in Jansco's cinema that might speak to that sort of utopian consciousness?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I guess I'll begin for me. I mean, I don't know if this is just overly simple. I mean, the act of critique itself is a bit of a utopian consciousness, right? I don't know. Does utopia have to be a resolution or a synthesis of critique? I'm not so sure. I mean, I don't think you can watch these films and I don't know, they didn't inspire me to change things politically necessarily. I don't think they work on that level, right? But I think the act of critique itself is a bit of that. And I don't know if that's dodging the question, but that kind of is the first thing that comes to mind for me.
Steve, do you want to say something? I could also say something.
No, you go ahead first.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I really liked both of your takes on Jansco, and I feel like just listening to you, I've kind of shifted my opinion. Like in terms of his contemporary reception, or his kind of his legacy. I'm wondering if yeah, maybe slow cinema isn't really like the best way of categorizing it. And in fact, the thing that came to my mind, and perhaps what makes him super relevant is a kind of like specifically like postmodern gesture of appropriation. And here I'm thinking of, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Neue Slowenische Kunst crowd here in like former territories of Yugoslavia, where you have like bands like Laibach rehearsing fascist propaganda in terms of their music and their video art. But there is something that is inherently, you know, coming out of socialist realism, or coming out of nationalist socialism, whichever version of totalitarianism aesthetics you want to pick, that is ironic, that is satire, that is sort of deeply historicized, but at the same time, it's like aestheticized politics, and it's making fun of itself. And I think that is kind of what I took from Zoran's talk and also your book, which is like I find this the way you phrase this as like inverted socialist realism to be really powerful, because I don't actually know if I would apply that to all of his sort of 6 films that we're talking about. I think it mostly applies to like the last 2, so like late 70s, where you really get the sense of pageantry in, you know, his ability to quote from a range of historical, really like anti-modernist, modernist, but also anti-modern sources. So I'm thinking about, you know, the heritage of Bartók, for example, in his films, and how, you know, Bartók really like treads a very fine line between sort of appropriating folklore and Brechtian distantiation, and how that really comes up in Jansco quite a bit, the appropriation of both Bartók and of that gesture, and how that's really quite postmodern. And I also wonder if that's another way of sort of riffing on what Steve said, which was I really like this contrast that you made in interpreting sort of the fluidity / destructive diagrammatic nature of Jansco, where you describe or you contrast him with the minimalism of Chantal Akerman, and I think that's really cool, because yeah, but what is the opposite of the minimalism of Chantal Akerman? You know, is it Baroque? You know, what is it? But I think that really goes to maybe it has something to do with this postmodern gesture of self-ironizing, of including everything in the picture frame and dismissing it at the same time. Anyway, I could go on, but
That's okay. That's great. To pick up for a second on your mention of Neue Slowenische Kunst, since they're a group I've been very interested in for a long time. It's sort of like when they started in the 1980s under communism in the then Yugoslavia, there kind of was, you know, there was a certain way in which the irony worked very powerfully in a way. They said, no, we support totalitarianism, we support repression, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and was kind of ironic. And the reason it worked was because the state, though it actually was repressive and totalitarian, was presented, we are humanists, we believe in the liberation and full flourishing of all human values, blah, blah, blah. So they sort of made a discourse that was like unreceivable, because they were basically saying, yes, we love communism because it's just like fascism, it regiments people, and, you know, I mean, it was a brilliant rhetorical technique to make the kind of official discourse short circuit. I think NSK and its various branches had more trouble dealing with, you know, what came afterwards, not just I don't just mean the Yugoslav wars, but also the sort of reestablishment of capitalism all throughout Eastern Europe. They tried to use some of the same ironic techniques, but they don't work as well as when they had, you know, the official Communist Party discourse as their target. And I think Jansco, in a different way, spends his whole life sort of addressing the same issues. And so that's where I like what you were saying about postmodern and irony. It's sort of like, I think part of the trouble is that we don't have a good enough vocabulary for different types of distanciation and irony. I think they aren't just one thing. And so if there's anything on the left which is ironic or distantiated, we cite Brecht. But I think that's only one mode of being ironic. I don't think that's particularly what Jansco was interested in. Not that I have a better, you know, positive citation of what he is, but I mean, they're very, you know, the way I've been thinking about these films is by writing short reviews of them on Facebook after I've watched them over the last week or so. And last night I was watching Agnus Dei from 1970, so it's from the same period as these 6 films, but it's a little different. It's basically completely about the communists and their supporters being slaughtered and massacred and tortured by fascist, proto-fascist Hungarian troops loyal to the Horthy government, which has just been installed. This is taking place in 1919, 1920, and which lasted through until the World War II years. And it's sort of like, I sort of felt my head was going to explode by seeing all these incredibly beautiful landscape and camera movements. At the same time, you have scenes where the cameras moving around are like a prepubescent girl is forced to strip naked and stand with her head down while somebody else reads in great detail a manual about the best way to torture people in order to make sure they suffer as much as possible before they finally lose consciousness and die. I mean, it's you know, it's sort of somehow that's ironic, like already isn't enough to express how kind of making your brain explode this kind of stuff is. And again, I think you see that a lot in all 6 of these films, but if you see the progression from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, it becomes more acute in Red Psalm and Electrum. I love, even though those two seem to be more envisioning a utopian solution, and then it goes haywire. And the films I've seen so far in the 80s, it goes completely haywire. And I haven't watched the 90s and early 2000s comedies yet, so I don't know how it works there. But I mean, it's sort of like Jansco is constantly exploring modes of irony and distanciation, which are at the same time very passionate and which somehow try to address a situation which cannot be addressed in very simplistic terms, but also probably can't even be expressed in an Adorno negative dialectic terms. You know, I mean, like many other people, I'm fascinated by Adorno and think he's brilliant, but also, you know, when you read about how he hates jazz and things like that, I think, you know, what's wrong with this guy? But there's a kind of way in which Jansco is asking the same kind of questions that all these other artists and philosophers are asking in Europe in the mid-20th century from both sides of the Iron Curtain, and giving a unique answer, but it's very hard to explain his answer because it's completely embodied in his work, not in a philosophical discourse. So that's...
Yeah, I wanted to add on to that. I mean, this is related to what Eszter was saying. I mean, one of the contradictions, perhaps more specifically here, you know, between the sort of the nationalists and the communists, or the folk forms versus the more modernist architecture. I don't, you know, I was trying to read it. I don't know how some of them, I mean, I've read in some cases he was just making up some of these folk imagery, but it strikes me with Red Psalm in particular, you know, and this is, you could see where, you know, the official government would say, oh no, this is too nationalist. He's very much embracing a kind of folk pageantry, a nationalist pageantry, but then turning that into a kind of narrative of liberation or permanent revolution. So, you know, that's the other, I think, contradiction, right? I mean, we think communism was supposed to overcome nationalism, right? I mean, think of Yugoslavia, brotherhood and unity, all these kinds of narratives, right? But so he seems to me holding them in a weird kind of tension, you know, or embracing both at the same time, particularly in the last 2 here, that I found quite fascinating. And I wasn't sure what to resolve them, how to resolve them either. And yeah, I don't, you know, when I sort of mentioning Adorno, yeah, I don't think, that was always interesting with Adorno, the difference between his taste and his actual rhetoric, right? But yeah, I don't, you know, I don't see what the resolution is between a lot of these contradictions, except, you know, the progression. You know, I've been watching some of the later films as well. I do think they get a little bit more apocalyptic and ironic before he gets to the 80s. You know, in the late 90s, you know, Lord Lanterns of Budapest, he's a character in the film. He's constantly interacting with the characters. So in some ways, there's a sense in which a kind of modernist project expires, and then all is left is a sort of recombination of various tropes and styles. I don't know if that's a fair criticism, because again, I haven't seen enough of those later films, but it really strikes me, not how different the later films are, but how everything's recontextualized when, like, there's no longer a critique of direct critique of state communism.
I'll just say something briefly. I basically agree with you. I don't think there is. I mean, it may be utopia, and this is a Adorno type thing to say. It may be utopia that there isn't a synthesis which puts everything together. There's a certain sense in which, he's a pessimist who doesn't see utopia as being realizable, but at the same time he is committed to needing to critique and to look for it. I mean, we were talking. I watched some of the Italian films, which are made for Italian television, which are very bizarre. One is about Attila the Hun in 450 AD, and the other is about. It doesn't take place in Rome, but in North Africa. But it's about the assassination of Julius Caesar, and they're both sort of reflecting. They're much lower budget. They're not as intricate, beautifully intricate as the Hungarian films, but they're both sort of reflecting on similar themes through this detour through ancient history. And the one about Caesar at the very end, it's these Romans who have been joining with the local people in North Africa, rebelling against Roman imperialism. But at the end, the two main characters, one of them turns out to be actually Octavius Caesar, who's brought back to become Julius's heir, and we know he will become Augustus in the future. And the other who is his best friend and the leader of the rebels, kills himself because he says, we don't want a better Caesar. That's an illusion. If you become Caesar, you'll just be as repressive of everybody. We want to eliminate Caesars altogether. And in order not to collaborate, the only way out is to kill himself. So we're left with that kind of aporia or suspension in that film. And that's, again, I think, a more simple film than many of his other films, but it's sort of the same things going on. So I would want to push on, and that would relate to how it's later development and to things what Eszter was saying about modernism versus postmodernism. Again, that seems to be something we don't have good enough words for, that there are more different things going on, which we shouldn't all put in the same category. And part of what I found so rewarding about watching these Jansco films is that he's one of the more singular. He's in this history and he's messing with the same things that other people are messing with, but he's doing it in a very unique way. And I don't quite have the words for what he's doing, but that's why I think he's so great.
Well, Zoran, you had mentioned, the question of where do we see his influence today, and sort of, were these experiments that he was making stylistic dead ends, or is it something that we need to keep rediscovering? Sort of just pose to everyone what's the place of Jansco's cinema now, and how can we get the most out of it?
I mean, I'll just say quickly, since I kind of posed that. I do think there's still a legacy of a kind of political modernism that you'd find, but this is a slight digression. I went and saw The Northman. I was reading an interview, and he said he'd watched the Roundup in preparation. I didn't see the connection, but I think the embrace of the sort of critique and the embrace of the contradictions is hopefully something that we can explore. I'm not sure I necessarily see it in other directors other than Laszlo Nemes, I mentioned, who's very much about the roving camera and the process and the procedure, although in a quite different way. To me, Bela Tar, is more akin to like a Tarkovsky or an Angopoulos. Although there's some relationship between like Angopoulos in Jansco, but I don't necessarily see that. Maybe that's just more of a problem of art cinema becoming a kind of corporate product itself, or a sort of globalized film style where he wins an award in Cannes for Red Solomon 72. Best director, I forget. I have a hard time seeing something like this winning at Cannes. I mean, I don't know if that's just me being a little cynical or not. But I'm curious what Eszter or Stephen might have to say about that.
Eszter, go ahead.
I don't know about his French reception. I think it's really it's mixed. But I think they appreciate it as in something that's very innate, as well as sort of invested in similar ideas of like maybe apparatus theory, just simply because his work is so like profoundly aware, or makes the viewer so aware of the planned nature of film. And so I think it resonates with a lot of film theory and film criticism that they're producing. But I think maybe, I don't know, maybe this is like kind of an extreme thought, but like maybe where I would place Jansco is in terms of like a very interesting like offshoot of the documentary, in the sense that like, okay, like he does like long takes and stuff, but and that, you know, that goes in various directions in terms of history, but like essentially what he's doing is he's kind of like doing what the cinema verite people are doing. He's just like, he's setting up his camera and then they're just winging it. I mean, okay, there of course there are important caveats to that, like, you know, like sometimes he orchestrates things, and I mean he choreographs stuff, but I mean it's really up to the actors, it's up to the horses, it's up to the animals, it's up to, like, you know, whoever happens to be moving by to interrupt the image, and there's plenty of opportunity for that. And I think that there's something that's very observational about Jansco, and potentially quite performative, that pushes cinema in the direction of theater and happenings, that makes it like closer to art, and like expanded types of cinema. I don't know, but that might be stretching it, but I think that there are different genealogies, and the performativity theater and might be one of them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't know. I mean, what impressed me the most, and which I don't think we have a good language for, is how Jansco is different from other people who are doing very similar types of things. Sorry, my dog is barking in the background. So I mean, as I tried to say earlier, it's sort of like Jansco starts out in socialist Hungary and responding to certain situation, and he responds in a very original way, though he's trying to negotiate some of the same difficulties that, say, other Hungarian, Polish, and Yugoslav and new wave directors are trying to do. Sort of how to be critical and at the same time, you know, having a different kind of vision. I don't know. I think it's interesting that the West ignored him after the mid-70s, when he was continued to be doing such interesting things. Maybe they're hard to contextualize. But anyway, so I mean, I sort of think it's not a dead end. It's that it's a very unique and singular approach, and the important thing is to invent new approaches, as you know, for new directors to invent new approaches and to continue to do that. And so you can imitate Jansco, but he's exemplary because of how he positions things. And how he tries to look for new solutions.
I think Eszter thinks you with the animal comment about.
Yeah.
That the horses are really.
And no horse runs in the frame. That'd be.
Philip, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Yeah, you know, Eszter's point about the movie being his movies also being theatrical and close to happenings. It's very interesting that counterpointed to the Baroque, let's call it a Baroque movement of the camera style, is a kind of spare but theatrical dialogue, particularly in the Roundup and also in the Red and the White. What is the dialogue in the Roundup? It's go over there, come back here, walk through that door, right? Which serves both a kind of repetitive function, a sort of poetic repetitive function, but also teaches us something about the nature of domination, as the person who is uttering these commands does. Most of the dialogue is the imperative. It's a way of saying, I have control over your body, and I want you to know that I have that over you before I do anything else, hang you or whatever. And even in the red and the white, it becomes the question of undressing people before they kill them. Take off your shoes, take off your pants, take off your shirt. They doesn't have to do that to someone he's going to kill anyway, unless the whole purpose of this kind of domination is to send a sort of message and kind of inscribe it into the victim's bones. But the stuff also works as a peculiar kind of repetitive minimalist poetry that's counterpointed to a form of movement, which is, let's call it Baroque, which is extravagant. So that too is a dimension of Jansco that's extraordinary, and it's not like Antonioni there, which you might think if you just look at the long take.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. Yeah.
This is a great discussion. And of course, I would love to continue it for another 2 hours, but I think we have to. We're coming to the end now. I want to thank Eszter over in Slovenia, and Zoran in Chicago, and Steve in Detroit, and Tommy with me in Seattle, who I'll see tonight when we watch The Red and the White again. If you've never seen it and you're in Seattle, go see this movie. It is absolutely wonderful.
It's very exciting to have film as part of Red May this year. And then here at the Beacon, we're going to keep this very specific current going beyond May into June as we mount the Marta Mesharos retrospective, which has been going. So
nice.
Anyone who's interested.
That is definitely worth seeing too. So thanks everybody for watching, and check in with us again for Rick Wolf's thing on the persistence of Cold War ideology. That I believe is Thursday at 11 a.m. But don't believe me, just look at www.redmayseattle.org. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.